So we've been discussing Paul's conversion, just started to. The debate, we said, in scholarly circles is over whether or not we should consider Paul to have converted at all, or whether it might not be more accurate to call his transformation a call, akin to Jeremiah's call in Jeremiah 1:5, from before his birth, to be a prophet, only in this case the Gentiles as well. To put it another way, the question becomes, did Paul change religion, or did he remain within Judaism? The popular Christian tradition has it that Paul was the hero of the Gentiles and the innovator of a new thing. My own view is that it is a category mistake to think of Paul as converting in the sense of changing his religion, or indeed seeking to found a new one, but that those who think of him as converting are nevertheless queuing into the indisputably profound change entry into the Christ movement wrought in Paul. It is clear to my mind that Paul still thought of himself as a Jew, and that this is one reason Hooker points out that he was on 5 occasions punished with the synagogue lashing, see 2 Corinthians 11:24, which was a discipline administered to a fellow Jew by Jews. If Paul had self-identified as starting a new non-Jewish religion, he could have spared himself the pain. More than that, this shows Paul clearly saw himself in some way as within Judaism, despite his phrase about his earlier life in Judaism, Galatians 1:13. It's sons who tend to be punished by their families, not by strangers. There are also very strong affirmations in Romans 9-11 of Paul's loyalty and ongoing passion for a people he still regards as his brothers. The Jews are those he considers his own people, his kindred according to the flesh. But he also agonizes over their rejection of Christ and could wish himself, quote, accursed and cut off from Christ for their sake. See Romans 9:3. And from there he proceeds to outline positively how Israel is the taproot of at least according to the flesh, of the Messiah. Romans 9:5. For Paul, Israel is the natural conduit of all God's working up to and including the Christ movement. This becomes even clearer in Romans 11:17-25, with Paul's rejection of the idea that a Gentile branch of Christianity should grow up to boast against and consider itself independent from its Jewish origins. Paul is able to maintain, I think, a balance between dismay and hope with regards to his people. He regards them as hardened, Romans 11:25, and yet he thinks Israel will be saved, Romans 11:26, from her sins. He says bluntly that as regards the gospel they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors, adding, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, Romans 11:28-30. This is hardly a man seeking to distance himself from Israel. Shifting the goalposts, how should we perceive his view of the law? Christa Stendal challenged the consensus in the 1960s and 70s concerning whether, quote, the original framework of Paul's thought was not the missionary concern of Jews and Gentiles rather than a dogmatic perspective such as justification by faith, and whether Romans 9-11 rather than 1-8 was the climax of the letter's argument. Stendhal's concern was that Western, especially Protestant, theology since the 16th century had taken Paul and made him captive to Luther's and our introspective anxieties over conscience and individual salvation. This is undoubtedly true, but the question is whether Paul's conversion was simply a matter of a call to apostleship. In my view, it is entirely inadequate to reduce Paul's experience simply to a calling, even though that element features strongly within it. Paul's transformation was more radical and profound than that, and I will argue, although he did not conceive of himself as having changed religion, he did experience a strong discontinuity with his past belief. The popular Christian tradition in this regard is distorted and misleading, but so are views which fail to do justice to the way the Christ encounter revolutionized his thinking and direction. This seems particularly the case with regards to the law, which, as Hegel, echoing Schweitzer and Sanders, rightly points out, in contrary to those two, by the way, it was no subsidiary crater, there's no minor sub-issue. Paul clearly delighted, but also sat critically with how the law was viewed in some respect. But the question, which we cannot explore in depth here, is how. The debate between the so-called old and new perspectives on Paul really comes down to this. Was Paul merely opposed to a demand that Gentiles, to be included in God's people, had to accept certain key boundary markers, works of the law, such as circumcision and Sabbath observance, or is he critical of a profounder theology of the law that also affects Jews? More of a universal, transnational criticism, if you like. John Gager sees the issues as being merely about ethnic boundary markers. That's how he conceives as Paul's problem with the law. It's just irrelevant now because it's simply there. It marks out the people of Israel, and now the gospel has expanded and exploded that vision into something that goes to the Gentiles, so therefore we shouldn't just insist that the Gentiles are limited to these Jewish rituals. Gager writes, this, contrary to the traditional view of Paul's conversion and its consequences, thus, contrary to the traditional view of Paul's conversion and its consequences, what changed was not his view of the law as such, or the law in relation to Israel, but only as it concerned the Gentiles. Well, I could not disagree more, and I find this astonishing. Surely, if we follow Paul's argument from Romans 6 through 8, what we see is Paul both delighting in the law, but also critiquing it as essentially inadequate to setting people, whether Jew or Gentile, free from the power of sin, which only the Spirit can do through Christ's death. Paul writes, God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and to deal with sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, so that the just requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Romans 8, 3-5. This is crucial, it seems to me, because what we see in Romans 6-8 is Paul affirming, in a letter intended for Jewish and Gentile leadership, the idea expressed elsewhere, like in Philippians 3:6 or Philippians 3:9, that there's a greater righteousness to be had than that had by Torah observance. The difficulty, perhaps, is that Paul seems to have succeeded in fulfilling the requirements of the law in Philippians 3:6, where he considers himself as having been blameless with regards to the requirements of the law. However, I suggest that a closer reading of that qualifies things, as it is possible to read him as saying, well, as regards the law type of righteousness, well, yes, I was faultless, but unless we're to render Philippians 3:9 slightly later meaningless, it clearly envisages a greater righteousness that comes through faith in Christ. I would stand with Segal and Hegel here in seeing a profound wrenching and a reversal in Paul's conversion and call. It was not a repudiation of Judaism, but it was a critical dialogue with it. I'm going to pause there and we'll go on to the next video in a moment.